I'm Paul Kennedy, and this is Ideas on the Corruption of Christianity.
In the age of the church, this idea of the neighbor who constantly lives encountering Christ in the unknown who knocks at his door and asks for hospitality. This idea of acting out of a love which is a gift gets corrupted by being defined as something which can be institutionalized, which charitable institutions can do much better than a bunch of individual Christians.
In June of 1968, Ivan Illich, then a Monsignor of the Roman Catholic Church, was summoned to Rome to appear before the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the modern descendant of the Inquisition. He had become, the document drawn up against him claimed, an object of curiosity, bewilderment, and scandal to the Church. At issue were Illich's activities as the director of the Center for Intercultural Documentation, or CIDOC, an organization he'd founded 7 years earlier in the Mexican city of Cuernavaca. Development in the poor countries was then at the top of the international agenda. The United States had just created the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps. The American Church had also stepped up its involvement in Latin America with the creation of a parallel Peace Corps called the Papal Volunteers. Illich denounced this campaign as a war on subsistence and predicted that the attempt to foist schools, hospitals, and highways on poor countries would produce social polarization and a painful modernization of poverty. He also protested his church's involvement in this secular crusade, and it was this opposition that resulted in Illich's call to Rome. A year later, Illich publicly withdrew from the priesthood. His views, he insisted, were entirely orthodox, but he was unwilling to carry on in the atmosphere of scandal created by the Vatican's proceedings against him. He continued in his analysis of the perverse effects of development, but now as an independent teacher, scholar, and writer. Notable among the many books that he subsequently wrote are Deschooling Society, Medical Nemesis, Gender, and In the Vineyard of the Text. 30 years ago, Ivan Illich criticized his church's complicity in spreading the modern gospel of health, schooling, and commodified consumption throughout the world. In the first of 5 Ideas programs, he goes a step further and argues that the church is, in fact, the original source of many of these institutions. The series is called The Corruption of Christianity. It's presented by David Cayley.
The corruption of the best is the worst. An old saying. You can find it in Aristotle, in Thomas Aquinas, and in Shakespeare, who says, "Sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds." I first heard this proverb from Ivan Illich, who said that for him it summed up the influence of organized Christianity on Western society. We were sitting at the time in his room in State College, Pennsylvania, where he was then teaching. I was there to prepare the profile of Illich, called Part Moon, Part Traveling Salesman, that was broadcast 11 years ago on Ideas. The idea that modern society is a corruption of Christianity didn't really fit the design of those programs, and at that point he wasn't prepared to discuss it at length in any case. But it happened that after the broadcast of my series, and the subsequent publication of a book called Ivan Illich in Conversation, we became close friends. And as this friendship grew, we returned again and again to this theme of the corruption of Christianity. He said that he intended to write a book on the subject, but as time went by, it became clear that illness would not allow him to carry out such a project, at least not to the exacting standard that he would set for himself. So I proposed that I record his thoughts. He, in time, agreed, and twice during the last 3 years we sat down together for a week to record the lengthy interviews from which these new programs are drawn. As you'll hear in a minute, the crowing of a rooster in the yard outside occasionally punctuated our talk. In the books for which he is best known, like Deschooling Society or Medical Nemesis, Illich consistently tried to make three central points. First, that modern institutions tend to defeat their own purposes. Schools inhibit learning. Medicine threatens health. Prisons aggravate crime. Second, that these institutions weaken the self-reliance of individuals and communities by cultivating needs which can only be met by professionalized services. And third, that they threaten people's ability both to enjoy and to bear the human condition, so that endless medical treatment, for example, undermines the art of suffering and of dying. In his more recent, less well-known work, Illich has spoken mainly as an historian, interested in uncovering the source of the certainties, the unquestioned, often invisible assumptions on which these institutions rest. Preeminent amongst these assumptions is the idea that human beings are made up of needs, and that society is organized in order to fulfill them, the good society being the one that does this best. Illich believes that this idea is a perversion of Christianity, and as we go on, he'll explain why he thinks so. But in order to follow that explanation, you need first to know how he understands the Christian revelation, and why he thinks it altered history in a permanent and irreversible way. And that is where our conversation begins.
I think I can provide historical evidence for my belief that angel, that Gabriel, who suddenly appeared in front of that Jewish girl and said Ave, cannot be neglected by the historian, and at the very same time did something which doesn't fit in the ordinary sense within history of a study of history. I believe that angel told that woman that she, from that moment on, was to be the mother of God. That he, whose names the Jews never wanted to pronounce, was from that moment on to be a human being, as really human as you, David, and I. I believe in that. I therefore listen to him as nobody before this event could have listened to another, looked at another. And this is what I live by. I therefore believe that the incarnation, the ensarkosis, the Greek word for the enfleshment of the biblical, the Quranic, the Christian Allah, represents a turning point in looking not on what happens in the world. And this is an extraordinary surprise and remains a surprise. It is not knowledge of the ordinary kind, it is knowledge which in my tradition one calls faith. And I do not cease to live in my faith when I study history.
Christian belief changed the world, Illich says, not just because, for faith, the world had changed, but because this belief entered history and shaped the ways in which people subsequently thought and acted. The incarnation, therefore, matters both to the historian and the believer. It occurred, he says, as the culmination of that unique vocation that appeared amongst the people of ancient Israel, prophecy.
The Old Testament, taken as a whole, is prophetic. Its centerpieces are people who speak about what is not yet, about the non-dum, the Latin word for not yet. What makes the Jewish people unique is that we have come into existence as a social we, an I in the plural, around the message that whatever happens in history and what can be seen in nature foreshadows, like pregnancy foreshadows birth. The prophets spoke with the claim to step outside the family and tribal context in which we know what tomorrow is, speaking about a tomorrow which will be totally surprising, messianic. It is around the announced Messiah that this historically unique phenomenon of God's people comes into existence. The Old Testament is pregnant with the Messiah.
This metaphor of pregnancy is explicit in the Apostle Paul, who writes to the Christians at Rome that until the appearance of the Christ, the whole of creation has been groaning in labor pains. But when Jesus appears, he is rejected, humiliated, and executed by the leaders of his community. Like the prophets, Illich says, he is forced by his calling outside the enclosed world of his people.
The Old Testament, taken as a whole, is prophetic. Its centerpieces are people who speak about what is not yet, about the non-dum, the Latin word for not yet. What makes the Jewish people unique is that we have come into existence as a social we, an I in the plural, around the message that whatever happens in history and what can be seen in nature foreshadows, like pregnancy foreshadows birth. The prophets spoke with the claim to step outside the family and tribal context in which we know what tomorrow is, speaking about a tomorrow which will be totally surprising, messianic. It is around the announced Messiah that this historically unique phenomenon of God's people comes into existence. The Old Testament is pregnant with the Messiah.
This metaphor of pregnancy is explicit in the Apostle Paul, who writes to the Christians at Rome that until the appearance of the Christ, the whole of creation has been groaning in labor pains. But when Jesus appears, he is rejected, humiliated, and executed by the leaders of his community. Like the prophets, Illich says, he is forced by his calling outside the enclosed world of his people.
If I rightly understand the point of the gospel, it's crucifixion. That is, Jesus, as our Savior, but also as our model, is condemned by his own people, led out of the city, executed, as somebody has blasphemed the community's God. He's not killed in any way, he's killed on the cross, that is hanged in a particular way. Now, hanging, both in suicide and as a form of execution, has in the Mediterranean tradition, by that time already a very powerful meaning. We know about some 250 acts of suicide described in Greco-Roman classical literature. I say with suicide for a moment because it's so clear there. The very first one is an Italic queen, very angry at her people whom she wants to leave, who hangs herself in the woods to die without touching the earth, because in that way she expects her spirit not to be absorbed back to the ancestors, but to remain around, to haunt the people. The execution on the gibbet, hanging, that is to die without touching the earth, is also explicitly dealt with in Roman and Greek tradition as a way of excluding you not only from our people here, but from our people in the other world, from our dead. If therefore we do take this man who says, let this chalice pass from me because he so much fears it, as our example, It is an example simultaneously of the loyalty to his people and the willingness to accept being excluded from them by what he stands for. This, in the supreme form, is the Christian attitude towards this worldly community, which then shows up as a way of behavior in everyday life.
By his crucifixion, Illich believes, Jesus showed his acceptance of the new freedom which he had invited his followers to share, the freedom to put love higher than law or custom. This is what makes the Christian New Testament, even though foreshadowed in the Old, still so utterly and explosively new in Illich's eyes. Men and women had been shaped, up to this time, by their obedience to the customs of the place, the people, today we would say the culture from which they had been born. Illich uses the Greek word ethnos, from which we get ethnic, for these bounded and self-contained worlds. The individual, the ego, the I, which I am, existed only as an instance of a prior defining we. Jesus asserted that human beings find their ultimate purpose not in obedience to custom, however hallowed, but by their free response to other persons. In so doing, he offered an expanded horizon, not just for love, but also for the betrayal of this love through the development of new forms of power.
I do believe that with the Christian message, an entirely new level of surprising flowering has become possible for knowledge and love. Since Christians believe that they can love the biblical God in the flesh. St. John says that he has put his head at table on his shoulder, that he has touched him, heard him, smelled him. And he has said that whoever sees him sees the Father. And whoever sees his brethren or loves his brethren loves him. In David Cayley, an entirely new dimension of love has become possible, which is extremely ambiguous, because it explodes the universal assumptions about the conditions of love being dictated by the people into which I've been born, the family in which I grew up, because it makes it possible for me to choose anywhere whom I will love, and thereby destroys or deeply threatens, that's better, the basis for ethics, which always has been ethnos, a historically given we, which precedes any pronunciation of the word I. So I believe that with the Christian message, with the New Testament, loving the other, love, gaze, and knowledge are possible in an entirely new horizon. But also a new danger exists. The attempt to manage, to ensure, to guarantee this love by institutionalization, by submitting it to legislation and making it law, by protecting it through the criminalization of its opposite. So I believe that with the Christian message, an entirely new ability in the self of giving oneself has become possible, but also an entirely new exercise of power, which is principally the power of those who organize Christianity, that is, church and churches, to use this vocation to claim their superiority as social institutions, as social organizations.
How this new exercise of power developed in the Church is a subject I'll return to shortly. But first, I'd like to linger a moment over what Illich calls the new flowering of Christian virtues that was made possible by the Gospel. The possibility of virtue, in Aristotle and other classical accounts, lies within the individual. By cultivating the manners and habits that befit my station, I can make myself virtuous. Christianity throws the accent onto the other, and onto the Holy Spirit, from whom I receive the possibility of virtuous action as a gift. This deep sensitivity of one to the other led to the creation of communities of an entirely new kind, communities animated by a spirit of contrition and mutual forgiveness rather than of rectitude. These communities were inspired by what one of Illich's most important teachers, the late Gerhard Ladner, called the idea of reform. But reform, in Latin reformatio, had for these early Christians a meaning it had never had before.
Reformatio or revolutio would mean the turning around of the stars, or the running of the sun through the spring cycle in a cosmic year, of a greening every year. But it could not mean what it means suddenly. All through Christendom, by the 4th century, a turning inward out, a considering the axioms on which I built my entire life and my feelings yesterday as those which I have to get rid of to be in an entirely new state. Basically contrition. Contrition is not motivated by a sense of culpability. It is deep sorrow, and it is based on the belief of the mercy of the other, who will forgive me my betrayal, not forgive me a transgression, or accept payment in satisfaction.
Mutual forgiveness, as opposed to the righteous demand for satisfaction of a wrong, was the characteristic mood of a community whose members keenly felt their dependence on one another. This feeling was founded on their experience of faith, because trusting dependence on the word of another, Illich says, is what faith finally means.
It's a different way of knowing than that which is based on my sensual experience and the resources of my intelligence. It is a way of taking for certain on the word of somebody else, whom I trust. It is making knowledge based on trust for myself more fundamental than anything which I can know by reason. But this, of course, is a possibility when I believe in the existence of God's word reaching me. When I believe him whom I trust is God, not you. But it does rub off on my relationship to you. It makes me aim at facing people willing to take them for what they reveal about themselves, not what I know about them. And this is very difficult to discuss after 100 years of dream interpretation by Freud. The psychoanalytic assumption that I can help you find out about yourself by understanding you more perfectly than you do inevitably colors in very fascinating and high-level forms and in very degraded, trivialized forms most of our relationships by now. One of the newnesses which come from him who says, I have come to make everything new, is exactly in dealing with the other, the willingness to accept him for what he tells me about himself, because only that way I can be surprised by him. Taking out the predictability from the face of the other.
Which is the analytic presumption to get behind.
The analytic and the Marxist sociological assumption implies is always an illusion. Illusion shaped by ideology, by social condition, by upbringing, by education. I mean, that's what I tried to do. Invite people to envisage this possibility, even when I couldn't talk to them explicitly about who my model is.
The capacity for surprise, for spontaneous, unpredictable turning towards another, is the essence of the freedom Illich finds in the New Testament. But it's part of the ambiguity of the gospel, as he said earlier, that this freedom can also be twisted into a planned and managed institutional response, which denatures it. He finds an example of this denaturing of the gospel in the way in which the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan has usually been understood by Christians. The tale is told in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus is asked, "Who is my neighbor?" He responds with a story about the rescue of a Jew by a Samaritan, an outsider to the religion which was centered on the temple in Jerusalem. To Illich, the parable perfectly illustrates the unforeseen horizons that Jesus hoped to open for his listeners. But the interpretations that have generally been applied to this story, he says, point in the opposite direction.
Some 30 years ago, I went into sermons from the early 3rd century into the 19th century, dealing with this story of the Samaritan. And I find out that most preachers, when they comment that passage, comment it in order to show how we ought to behave towards our neighbor. Where in fact, this is the opposite of what Jesus, who tells that story of the Samaritan, wanted to point out. The Pharisees came to ask him, "Master, teacher, tell us, who is my neighbor?" They didn't ask him how does one behave to one's neighbor. They asked him point blank the question, who is the guy whom you call neighbor? And he, as a story told them, a man was going down to Jericho, fell among the robbers, was beaten up, and left wounded. A teacher goes by, a priest goes by, sees him, and walks on. And then that outsider comes along, his original enemy, and turns over to him. There's an internal turning, and picks him up, takes him into his arms, and brings him to the inn. So he answers them, "My neighbor is whom I decide, not whom I have to choose." There is no way of categorizing who my neighbor ought to be. This doctrine about the neighbor, which this guy Jesus brings into conversation, is utterly destructive of ordinary decency, of ethical behavior. And to say this today is as surprising as it was at the beginning.
The teaching of Jesus in this parable is destructive of ethical decency because of the way in which it shows and commends the violation of a sacrosanct boundary between those to whom I belong and to whom I have an obligation, and those others who arrange things in their own way and ought not to be my concern. If the story were told today, as Illich has sometimes pointed out, it would reacquire its power to shock by showing a Palestinian caring for an injured Jew. The Samaritan does not what he ought to do, as the preachers Illich consulted argued, but precisely what he ought not to do. Ethics, traditionally, were formed within an ethnic boundary that gave them shape and substance. Jesus, Illich says, indicated a different, more open-ended possibility.
The master told them, who your neighbor is not determined by your birth, by your condition, by the language which you speak, by the ethnos, which means really the mode of walking which has become proper to you, but to you. You can recognize the other man who is out of bounds culturally, who is foreign linguistically, who, you can say by providence or by pure chance, is the one who lies somewhere along your road in the grass, and create the supreme form of relatedness, which is not given by creation, but created by you.
This voluntary, created relationship, Illich stresses, cannot be made into an abstract or universal duty. It is a free, unconditioned response, and as such cannot be converted into an ethical norm or rule. What the Samaritan undertakes, by its very nature, is a concrete, specific, bodily tie between two people.
This is not a spiritual relationship. This is an act which prolongs the incarnation. As God became flesh, and in the flesh relates to each one of us, so you are capable of relating in the flesh to that other man who has been beaten up. Take out this fleshy, bodily, carnal, dense experience of self, and therefore of the thou, from the story of the Samaritan, and you have a nice liberal fantasy, which is something horrible.